Welcome to our Summer Devos with Sunset. We hope you've enjoyed our little series on life lessons. Today will be the last one of those. Before coming to Sunset, I spent almost 20 years as a small business owner. Now, as a business owner, you tend to become accustomed to having control over things, and you struggle with dealing with things that you can't control. And I'm no exception to that. The problem with this is that most things are out of our control. For example, none of us can control the fact that the world was hit with a pandemic. We didn't start it, and we can't stop it. We can take measures to protect ourselves and others, but stopping it is out of our control. Another thing, there is seemingly an unprecedented amount of strife and disunity in our world right now, and especially in our own nation. This, by and large, is simply out of our control. We can choose to respond with love and kindness rather than with hate and hostility, but we can't stop the disunity and hate in the world as a whole. On a simpler level, anytime we drive, we can't control what the other person in the other car is going to do, even though we might like to think that all of the directions that we give them from the driver's seat will make a big change in their way of driving. The point is, the world is just something that we cannot control. Now, for people like me, that's a bit of a struggle. But the longer I've lived, the more I have learned to accept this one truth. God has things under control, and he has things worked out. It's easy to say, right? But it's not that easy to genuinely grasp. I want to share with you today a text that has been very helpful to me in giving me comfort that God has things worked out. And it's from the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 9 in just a moment. Now, Daniel, as a prophet, was working during the 70-year exile of the Israelite people in the country of Babylon. For over 400 years, the Israelites had played the harlot with all sorts of sinfulness. They had messed around in idolatry and every other form of sin that you can possibly imagine. And God had finally had enough, and he sent in the Babylonians to take them out. They destroyed the temple, and they took God's people into captivity. It would have been a very dark time in their history, and especially for people like Daniel. But Daniel was a man of prayer, and he was a man of deep faith, and he knew how to combat those feelings whenever he would struggle with a strong prayer life. One of those prayers that we're going to look at just briefly is recorded in Daniel chapter 9. Now, as the chapter opens, we find Daniel reading from the prophet Jeremiah concerning the 70-year period in which Daniel is living. And he realizes that these 70 years should be about over. And so he prays to God. He begs God to act now and to deliver the people. And that's exactly what he says in chapter 9 and verse 19. He says, "Hear, forgive, and take action now." While Daniel is praying, God answers his prayer with one of the most complex answers in all of Scripture. But a careful examination of the answer demonstrates that God not only has control over things, he has history, future history to Daniel at this time, worked out for his glory and for his people. I can't imagine what Daniel must have felt when he heard this. But in verse 24 of Daniel 9, the answer begins, and God gives Daniel highlights of 6 major things that he's going to do with the Israelites from that moment in time, which would have been about 539 BC, all the way forward to 70 AD. So over 600 years of history, God has it worked out. And here's what he says. He says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. In verse 25, he goes on to discuss a decree that will allow the people to return to Jerusalem, and even more highlights that go with that. But we're not going to get into that in this Devo. One thing that is patently obvious from a surface reading of this is that God has things worked out. But there's another observation that we need to make here, and that is that God is more concerned with the eternal future of people than he is with the material. In essence, he says, Daniel, don't worry. Israel will go back and rebuild like I prophesied. But more importantly, I'm going to take care of the sin problem forever. Can you imagine what it would have been like to get an answer to a prayer like this? Well, here's the application. This passage highlights one major truth that every Christian needs to internalize. While we may struggle with uncertainty, God not only has things worked out in the temporal world, he has worked out our eternal destiny by taking care of the sin problem, and that's really the only thing that matters anyway. Daniel 9 brings even more light to passages like Romans 8:28. You know, the one that says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Since the beginning of time, God has been at work accomplishing his purpose to save the lost, to transform the saved, to be like Jesus, and to bring glory to himself. And we can rest assured that he is still doing that today. Times of uncertainty can test all of us, especially those of us who tend to struggle with control. But we need to give it over to God, who is the only one in control of things anyway. He has things worked out, and we can take comfort that no matter what happens in history, God is working his purpose.